In this video, we are going to be talking about the Node executable. So the Node executable is the runtime of Node. It's the thing that's responsible for executing our code, be it on the server or on the desktop. And what we're going to do here is we're going to show two basic use cases of Node. How to run it in a REPL loop, or that was redundant, but a REPL, or how to run a file, how to actually execute a JavaScript file on our desktop. And it's really important to understand, but very straightforward. So let's just hop right in. First of all, we're going to talk about how to run a REPL. So a REPL is a read, evaluate, print loop. And the purpose of it is, well, basically those four things. The purpose of a REPL is you type in code, you hit enter, it gets ran, you get the result. And it's a very great way to interactively discover things about libraries or test things out really quickly. And I encourage people to be aware of it and use it to their advantage when they want to kind of poke around in a library and kind of get a feel for how things work. So the way that we enter the REPL is simply by typing in node and hitting enter. And we're now in the REPL. So you're probably already familiar with the concept of a REPL. I mean, pretty much every dynamic language has one, be it PHP or Ruby or whatever, and some compiled languages do too, such as C#. And what we can do here is we can just type in arbitrary JavaScript code, whatever we want. So for example, I can go ahead and type in the expression, a string literal in this case, hello world. So notice how I am using double quotes here because this is JavaScript code. Now, when I hit enter, what we get back is the result of that expression. So this expression is simply a string literal, and we get the result back right there. You can also execute any arbitrary JavaScript function that's been defined or included. So, for example, I can say console log hello world. Now, this will be an interesting one. So watch what happens. You'll notice up here we get hello world written out to the console as a result of invoking console.log, but then we get this undefined. So what that means is what we got here on the last line is the result of invoking this method. So it's the return value. And because console.log doesn't have a return value, we get undefined printed to the console. So don't freak out when you see undefined. That just means that the expression you typed in doesn't have a value. So speaking of that, we can do a whole lot of fun stuff in this REPL. Like I said, you can do anything from requiring in different modules. You can execute any arbitrary JavaScript code you want. You can define functions and variables if you want. For example, if I go ahead and say var left equals 20 and hit enter, now you'll notice that it works. I didn't get an error or anything, but it says undefined. And that's because in JavaScript, a variable declaration like this doesn't actually return a value, unlike some languages. However, inside of our session, left is now defined. So I can simply type in left, hit enter, and I get the result back. I could also say console.log left. And I get, like I said, like just before, I get 20, and then I get undefined as the result of console.log. So then I can also do var right equals 30, and then I can do something like let's make an object and say add is left plus right and sub is left minus right and hit enter. And notice how the result of this expression, which is creating an object in JavaScript object notation, you notice the curlies, is this object being printed out into the screen. So again, really fun way. A lot of people forget about the REPL and just sit around and make dummy files all the time to do whatever. But it's a really great way to poke into libraries and just kind of test things out, I guess. But that's enough of that. Let's go ahead and hop out of this and actually create a file and execute that file, because that's going to be a more common use case for everything you're going to be doing. To exit the REPL, all you have to do is hit Control-C twice. So I'm going to hit Control-C once, and then it says to exit plus Control-C again, or type.exit. You can do that too. But in the terminal or command lines, I'm used to using the command keys. And I do it again, and we're now exited. Okay, so let's talk about creating a file. So right now, I'm in a directory, eProjects Courses 01 Intro, and that's an empty directory. If you don't believe me, I have it open right here, and you can take a look at it. So it's an empty directory that we're going to be using to create a file in. Now, what I'm going to be doing here is I want to go ahead and launch Visual Studio Code. So when you're working mostly in the command line, the easiest way to launch Visual Studio Code is to use the code command. So Visual Studio Code can optionally, and it would be best if you did this, add a path variable to where we can access it wherever we want to from our command line. So I could type in code, and hit enter, and it would open Visual Studio Code. But it's not going to open it in the way that I want. What I want code to open in, I want it to open as a project in the current directory. So I want to open up Visual Studio Code, but I want it to consider the current directory to be our current project. So to do that, I specify a parameter here. And the parameter I'm going to specify is ./ and ./ simply references the current directory. So then I can hit enter, and you'll notice Visual Studio Code pops up. And if I expand this, we'll see that we have our Solution Explorer, File Explorer, whatever they call this window. I'm probably going to say Solution Explorer because I'm so used to Visual Studio. Our Solution Explorer right here showing us all the available files in this directory. But it doesn't matter if you're using code or not. Just go ahead and launch an editor yeah, stuff and things. So let's go ahead and create a file. So in code, what we do up here is we hover over this directory that we're in, and we just hit this new file button. Now, I'm going to go ahead and create a file. It's going to be a JavaScript file, so it's going to end in the .js extension. But I'm going to name it something specific, and this is important. I'm going to name it index.js, and then I'm going to hit enter. And after I do that, I'm going to collapse my Solution Explorer here by bringing over my mouse over to this resizing grip, and just collapse it like that. So I have more room here on my limited resolution. So inside of index.js, we can write pretty much any JavaScript we want. Now, obviously, we're not going to have access to our DOM, our document object model. We're not going to be writing HTML. We're not going to be doing anything that you might normally do in a JavaScript environment that you might be used to. We're going to be doing things that are more similar to a Perl script or a Ruby script or something like that, where we can just execute arbitrary JavaScript and do a bunch of fun stuff. So to prove that, let's go ahead and just write some basic JavaScript. Let's just say console log hello world. Not that exciting. And let's execute it. So because of the way I named this file, there's two ways to execute this file. The first way is to type in node space and then specify the file name. So I can specify index.js, and then I can hit enter. So it's not surprising that Node accepts a file name that we can use to have it execute. And in this case, look at that output. We got hello world right here, and that was just the result of Node executing this JavaScript file. Now, there's another way to execute this file. And it's a direct consequence to the name that I gave this file. Remember how I said that the file name is kind of important here when I named this index.js. And basically what happens is Node can not only execute files, but it can also execute directories. And when it executes a directory, it's going to look for a default file within that directory. Now we can override that default file that it might look for, but we're going to talk about that more once we talk about more about NPM. For now, just know that the default, and yes, I did mean to say it twice, the default file is index.js. So if you haven't overridden it anywhere else, the default file is index.js. So now we can execute this directory. So what I can do here is I can say node space and then dot. And of course, the dot references the current directory that we're in. And in this case, it's right here you see what directory we're in. We're in the same directory as this index.js file. And we hit enter, and we get the script executed. So yeah, that's really the basics of using the Node executable. I just wanted to point out how that worked. And I think in the next video, we'll talk about CommonJS and how we can include multiple files. That's where things really get interesting. Now, if you want to know more about the Node executable, because these are the only two ways, or three ways, if you include the REPL, that we are going to be using it, you can always do node-help, and it'll give you a list of different options that we can use. Now, most of these options are for things like debugging or overriding certain environment variables that we can set. And of course, you can always find the documentation on nodejs.org. There's no way I can cover every single aspect of Node.js and NPM in this course, so definitely be sure to hit up their docs if something is missing that you want to explain, because they're excellent resources. Anyway, we'll see you guys in the next video.